Wife discovers husband's secret affair with neighbor after 35 years of marriage. True crime stories. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Sarah noticed something unusual. The coffee pot clicked off, and the house fell into a rare silence. She had been married to Tom for 35 years. She trusted him completely. But today, a strange unease crept over her. As she shuffled across the kitchen, she spotted a piece of paper on the counter. It wasn't there the night before. Her heartbeat quickened as she picked it up. A hotel receipt. Her fingers trembled as she read the date, just 2 days ago. It was for a room booked under Tom's name at a luxury hotel just outside town. Confusion bubbled up inside her. Why would he need a hotel room? And why hadn't he mentioned it? The walls of the kitchen felt suddenly tight, the air thick with the weight of her thoughts. She tried to push the anxiety away, but it lingered, pressing down like an unshakable fog. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together fragments she had ignored for years. Tom had been coming home late lately, and there were moments when his phone buzzed with strange messages. He was distant, but she convinced herself it was just the stress of work. But now everything was different. Sarah's gaze shifted toward the living room window. Outside, she saw the neighbor Claire talking to Tom in the garden. They were too close, laughing a little too freely. It was unsettling, but she shook it off. She needed to trust her husband. Then, a sudden thought struck her. What if that's how it started? That nagging voice inside her couldn't be ignored anymore. She needed to know the truth. With shaking hands, she grabbed her coat and stepped out the door. The cool air hit her face, grounding her as she approached Claire's house. Her steps were slow but deliberate, each one filled with uncertainty. She reached the door and knocked, her heart racing in her chest. Claire opened it, her face bright with a smile. "Hello, Sarah. How are you?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. Sarah couldn't look her in the eyes. She just asked the question, "Is Tom with you?" The smile faltered, but only for a second. Yes, he was just here. He left a while ago, but Sarah could see it in her eyes. The truth was out there, hidden behind the facade of a smile. The air felt colder now, heavier. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked back to her house, her legs unsteady. She opened the door, and there he was, Tom, sitting in the living room as if nothing had changed. She froze, staring at him. He looked up, and for a moment, their eyes locked. A tension crackled between them. He knew. She knew. And for the first time in 35 years, Sarah didn't know what to say. The silence was deafening. She had never felt more alone. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the silence thick and suffocating. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her breath shallow. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her voice refused to come. Tom cleared his throat, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding hers. "Sarah," he began, but his words faltered. He stood up slowly, taking a cautious step toward her. "Before you say anything," he hesitated again, running a hand through his hair. "I never wanted you to find out this way." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of guilt. Sarah felt her stomach twist. She didn't need him to explain. The truth was already clear. Her body felt numb, and her mind raced, as if trying to outrun the crushing realization. "How long?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. 3 years, Tom admitted, his voice barely audible. A sharp pain hit Sarah's chest like a physical blow. 3 years. All that time, she had been living in a lie. "Claire," she managed to ask, her throat dry. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The name tasted bitter on her tongue. It felt as though the walls of the room were closing in, tightening around her, suffocating her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. But his apology felt hollow, like a far-off echo, lost in the vast emptiness between them. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't look at him anymore. She turned, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the door. "Sarah, please." Tom's voice was desperate now, but she didn't stop. She opened the door, the cold air rushing in like a wave. With each step she took away from him, the weight of betrayal pressed down harder. But her body moved on its own, her mind numb with shock. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't want to stay here. Not with him. not in a house that no longer felt like home. Her feet carried her down the street, past the familiar houses and streets she had walked for years. Everything felt distant now, as if the world had shifted beneath her without warning. She needed air. She needed space. Sarah found herself standing in the park just a few blocks away, the cold biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her chest rose and fell, each breath more painful than the last. For the first time in her life, she felt completely alone. Her entire world had just shattered, and she didn't know how to put it back together. She sank onto a bench, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of everything. The betrayal, the lies, the woman who had been so close to her for all these years. Her mind spiraled with questions she couldn't answer. How could he do this to her? Why didn't she see it? What was the point of the last 35 years? The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, and Sarah let herself cry. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of anger was beginning to form. She had been deceived for far too long, and now she would have to find a way to move forward. Even if it meant starting over from nothing. The tears slowed, but the anger in Sarah's chest grew stronger with each passing second. She sat on the park bench, her hands clenched in a fist in her lap. The world around her seemed to blur as she focused on the weight of the betrayal, the hollow feeling that had settled deep inside her. How could she have been so blind? But more than that, how could he have done this to her? The thought of Claire made her stomach churn. Her mind replayed all those times she'd seen the neighbor, smiling, friendly, always pretending to be just another part of their life. How long had Claire been hiding behind that mask of friendship? How long had she been playing this game right under Sarah's nose? The anger began to simmer, a deep, almost primal fury building within her. She wanted to scream, to confront them both, to tear the lies apart. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't about them. This was about her. She stood up suddenly, her decision made. It wasn't the end of her life, not by a long shot. It was just the beginning of something new. Sarah didn't know exactly what that new life would look like, but she knew one thing for certain: it wouldn't include Tom. Not anymore. Her first stop was to gather her things from their home, the house they had built together over decades. She couldn't stay there, not now, but she had to be strong. She didn't want to show him how much this was breaking her. She didn't want him to see the depth of the hurt that was consuming her from within. When she arrived back home, Tom was sitting on the couch, looking as lost as she felt. But Sarah didn't see the man she had loved for all these years. She saw a stranger, a man who had taken everything from her. She walked past him without a word, heading straight for their bedroom. She opened the closet, pulling out clothes one by one, tossing them into a bag. "Sarah," Tom called softly from behind her, his voice trembling. She didn't turn around. "Are you really going to leave me?" His voice cracked, the words hanging in the air, desperate and full of regret. She paused for a moment, her back still to him. For a split second, a part of her almost wanted to turn around, to beg him to explain, to make it all right. But that part was gone now. All that was left was the woman who had been betrayed. The woman who knew her worth. "I'm done, Tom," she said, her voice steady. "I'm done living a lie." She didn't give him a chance to respond. She grabbed her bag and walked out the door, closing it softly behind her. Her heart was heavy, but her steps were firm. She didn't know what the future held, but she was done being trapped in the past. As she walked away, the weight of betrayal still hung over her like a storm cloud, but she was finally free. And with every step, she felt herself growing stronger, inch by inch, moment by moment. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of control. The world might have been turned upside down, but she was going to rebuild her life. And no one, especially not Tom or Claire, was going to take that away from her. Sarah's footsteps echoed in the empty street, each one sounding louder than the last. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating warmth of the house she'd just left behind. Her heart, though still aching, felt like it was finally starting to breathe again. She didn't know where she was headed, but she couldn't stay in the town that had been a stage for her heartbreak. She had always dreamed of traveling, seeing the world beyond the confines of her small town. And now, more than ever, it felt like the right time to pursue those dreams. She made her way to the bus station, her mind already racing with possibilities. She didn't need answers right now. What she needed was freedom. Freedom from the lies, the guilt, the hurt that had been her reality for so long. The bus arrived soon after, its engine humming in the distance. Sarah took a deep breath and climbed aboard, her heart a mixture of uncertainty and hope. As the bus pulled away, she glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the familiar streets one last time. The town she called home for so long would no longer be a part of her story. This was her moment to let go, to rewrite her own narrative. Hours later, Sarah found herself in a bustling city, her senses overwhelmed by the noise, the movement, the endless possibilities. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt small, but in a good way. No one knew her here. No one knew the pain she carried. She could be anyone. She could be herself. Her journey had only just begun. Sarah spent the next few days settling into a small apartment, one with wide windows and a view of the city's skyline. It was nothing grand, but it was hers. She was determined to make it a place where she could heal, rebuild, and rediscover the woman she had almost forgotten. But the anger she had felt before, the sharp edge of betrayal, was slowly turning into something else: resilience. She was learning to let go of the past, piece by piece. Over time, she met new people, found new passions, and discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. Though her heart still carried the scar of her marriage, it was no longer a source of pain. It had become a reminder of how far she had come. Tom and Claire remained a part of her past, a chapter that she no longer had to live in. Sarah had closed that door, and as she looked out over the city from her new home, she knew that no matter how broken she felt in that moment, her story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and this time, she would write it on her own terms. As the weeks passed, Sarah's life began to settle into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm she had never known before. The city, with all its chaos and noise, had a strange calming effect on her. She was no longer bound by the quiet, predictable days of her former life. Here, there were endless opportunities, faces, and stories. Sarah threw herself into new experiences, from taking cooking classes to visiting art galleries, and even joining a small book club at a local cafe. It wasn't about filling the void that Tom had left. It was about rediscovering who she was without him, and more importantly, without the weight of the lies that had kept her tethered to a past she could no longer accept. One evening, after a long day at work, Sarah found herself sitting at the same cafe where she had joined the book club. The warm, flickering candlelight on the tables cast soft shadows, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. For the first time in ages, she felt peaceful. The door opened, and she looked up, startled by the familiar voice that called her name. "Sarah?" She turned to find Claire standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. A sharp pang of discomfort sliced through Sarah, but she held her ground, her posture straightening, her heart no longer afraid. Claire's eyes flickered around the room before landing back on Sarah, her gaze avoiding direct contact for just a moment. I didn't know where else to go," Claire said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't let the anger surface. She had learned the hard way how to keep her emotions in check. "Why are you here, Claire?" Sarah asked calmly, though her words held an edge. Claire hesitated, glancing down at the floor before meeting Sarah's eyes. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." The sincerity, or at least the attempt at sincerity, was evident, but it wasn't enough. "You should have thought about that before," Sarah replied, her voice steady but cold. "Before you betrayed me. Before you became part of his lies." Claire nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I've regretted it every single day since. But I've lost Tom too. He never wanted me. I was just a distraction. And now I don't know who I am without him." Sarah could see the cracks in Claire's carefully constructed facade, but it didn't matter. For so long, she had been in the same position, wanting someone who didn't truly care. But she had learned the hard way that her own worth was not tied to anyone else. You still have a choice, Sarah said softly. Just like I did, you can walk away and rebuild. Or you can keep chasing something that was never yours to begin with. Claire looked at her, the tears finally falling. But Sarah didn't feel pity. She felt something else, strength. A strength that came from knowing her own worth. Claire took a deep breath, nodding slowly, as if Sarah's words had cracked open something inside of her. After a long pause, Claire whispered, I don't know how to fix this. I don't think I can. Sarah simply shook her head. You don't need to fix anything. You just need to move forward. With that, Sarah stood up. The weight of the past finally lifted from her shoulders. She didn't need closure from Claire or from Tom. She had already closed that chapter. As she left the cafe and stepped into the cool night air, she felt the heaviness that had once clung to her slowly melt away. For the first time, the future felt wide open, like a blank page waiting to be filled. Sarah knew that there would still be days when the past tried to creep back into her thoughts, but she had learned how to silence it. Her journey was far from over, and she would face whatever came her way with the same strength and courage she had found within herself. She didn't need anyone else's validation. She was enough just as she was. As Sarah walked through the bustling city streets, the night air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of newfound freedom. She didn't know where she was headed next, but for the first time in years, the uncertainty felt like an adventure, not a burden. The weight of the past had been lifted, and the possibility of a future, her future, spread out before her like an open road. As she passed a neon-lit bookstore, she was drawn in by the glow of the lights. She had always loved reading, always found comfort in the words of others. Now the thought of losing herself in a new book felt like exactly what she needed. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, and was immediately surrounded by the familiar scent of paper and ink. The store was quiet. The only sounds the soft shuffle of pages being turned and the occasional murmur of other customers. Sarah wandered through the aisles, her fingers grazing over the spines of books, feeling the comfort of their presence. It wasn't long before she found herself in the self-help section, drawn to the titles about overcoming pain, rediscovery, and strength. She picked one up, its cover simple yet inviting, the words, "Rebuilding After Loss," printed in bold letters across the front. Without hesitation, she took it to the counter and made her purchase. It felt like the right choice, like a small but significant step toward her own healing. As she left the bookstore, the city around her seemed to pulse with life, the lights shining brighter than they had earlier in the evening. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it head-on. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to embrace her new life with an open heart. She joined a local writing group, poured herself into her work, and started volunteering at a shelter for women in need. Every day, she felt herself growing stronger, more confident, and more sure of who she was. But the biggest change was within her heart. The anger that had once burned so fiercely inside her had transformed into something more powerful: acceptance. She no longer needed the validation of Tom, Claire, or anyone else to define her worth. Her worth came from within. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting in her favorite cafe, reading a passage from the book she had bought, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She looked up, startled, only to find a man standing there, a warm smile on his face. "Excuse me," he said, his voice friendly and sincere. "I couldn't help but notice you here all the time. You always seem so at peace." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. She had become the kind of woman who could find peace in her own company, and that was more than enough. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm just taking life one day at a time." He smiled back, his eyes kind. "Well, if you ever feel like sharing that peace with someone over a cup of coffee, I'd be happy to join you." For a moment, Sarah hesitated, unsure. But then, she realized something. She had no need to rush. The rest of her life was still unfolding, and she didn't need anyone to complete her. "Maybe one day," she said with a smile, her voice warm but resolute. As the man walked away, Sarah felt a quiet joy settle within her. She had finally arrived at a place where she could live fully on her own terms. And in that moment, With the city alive around her, Sarah knew that no matter what came next, she was ready to face it all. Not because she was perfect, but because she had learned to embrace the imperfections. The journey ahead was hers to write. And this time, it was her story that as the days turned into weeks, Sarah's life continued to blossom in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of purpose, eager to embrace whatever the day would bring. Her apartment, once a temporary escape, had transformed into her sanctuary, a place where she could recharge, reflect, and grow. The weight of the past, though still a distant memory, no longer held her back. She found herself smiling more often, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely felt happiness creeping back into her life. The small things, like a fresh cup of coffee in the morning or the quiet satisfaction of finishing a book, became moments of contentment that she had once overlooked. Her confidence, once shattered, now stood tall, grounded in the lessons of the past. One evening, as Sarah walked through the city streets, she passed by the park where she had once sat, broken and uncertain, after confronting Tom. The memory felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. She smiled softly to herself, grateful for the strength she had found in herself. It was in moments like these that she realized how far she had come, not just physically but emotionally. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She checked the message, a simple text from an unknown number. Asterisk Sarah, it's Claire. I need to talk. Asterisk. For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from Claire since their encounter in the cafe. Claire's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, I've regretted it every single day. Asterisk. But Sarah had moved on. She had already forgiven Claire in her heart, not for Claire's sake, but for her own. The past was behind her, and nothing could change that. Still, something stirred inside her. Curiosity, perhaps, or a final need for closure. She decided to meet Claire, to hear her out, if only to put the chapter fully to rest. A few days later, they sat across from each other at a small, quiet cafe, the same one where Sarah had first heard Claire's apology. Claire looked different this time, tired, worn, and perhaps even a bit lighter. But there was no mistaking the remorse in her eyes. I never thought I'd see you again, Sarah said, her voice steady, though there was a touch of sadness in it. Claire looked down at her hands, twisting the napkin in front of her. I didn't expect to ever have the chance to make things right. But I couldn't live with myself knowing I hurt you and Tom both. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart calm. I've made peace with it, Claire, she said gently. I've moved on, and I've forgiven you. Not for you, but for me. I couldn't carry the anger anymore. Claire's eyes welled up with tears. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know I can't undo the damage. But I'm truly sorry. The apology, while sincere, didn't bring back the years that had been stolen. But that was okay. Sarah didn't need to hold on to the pain anymore. I appreciate that, Sarah said with a small smile, her voice soft. But it's time for both of us to move forward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not one of tension, but of acceptance, an understanding that some things could never be fixed, but they could be learned from. Finally, Sarah stood up, a sense of finality in her actions. Goodbye, Claire, she said quietly, her tone firm but compassionate. Goodbye, Sarah, Claire replied, her voice thick with emotion. As Sarah walked away, she felt the last remnants of her past slip further away from her. She had healed, truly and fully, and was now free to embrace the life ahead of her. The city, with its endless opportunities, seemed to welcome her with open arms. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. Sarah continued walking, each step carrying her further from the past, closer to the life she was now building for herself. The city was alive, and as she walked through its streets, she realized how much of the world she had yet to experience. There were new places to visit, new people to meet, and a new version of herself to discover. For the first time in so long, she felt open to all the possibilities the future could offer. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an old friend. It was Emma, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The message was simple. Asterisk, are you free this weekend? I'm in town and would love to catch up. Asterisk. Sarah smiled, her heart lifting at the thought of reconnecting. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to get close to anyone, but the invitation felt like the right next step. She replied almost immediately. Asterisk, I'd love to. Let's do it. Asterisk. As she set the phone down, Sarah paused to take in the surroundings. People laughing, friends talking, the hum of life happening all around her. It felt like she was witnessing the world for the first time, and she was no longer just a passive observer. She was a participant in her own life, a life she was now living on her own terms. That weekend, she met Emma at a cozy little restaurant with a terrace that overlooked the city skyline. The moment Emma walked in, Sarah felt a warmth flood her chest, knowing that this was the kind of connection she had been craving. Their conversation picked up effortlessly, like no time had passed at all. They laughed about old memories, shared stories of where life had taken them, and talked about everything they had missed in each other's lives. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt truly seen by someone who had known her before everything had changed. It was a reminder that, no matter how far she had come, there were still pieces of her past that were worth holding on to. As the evening wore on, Sarah felt a sense of contentment settle over her. She wasn't just healing anymore, she was thriving. She had learned to embrace the uncertain, the new, and the unknown, and in doing so, she had found peace. When the night came to an end, Emma walked her to the bus stop, where they exchanged a warm hug. "Thank you for today," Sarah said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "No, thank you for letting me back into your life," Emma replied with a knowing smile. "It's good to see you like this, happy, free." As Sarah waved goodbye and boarded the bus, she reflected on the evening. It was moments like these, filled with laughter and genuine connection, that proved she had come full circle. She had found her way back to herself, not in the absence of love or support, but through the strength to move forward and create a life that was all her own. And as the bus pulled away, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The future wasn't just a distant idea anymore. It was real, and it was hers to shape. No more looking back, only forward, only new beginnings. Sarah smiled, ready for whatever the next chapter would bring. As the bus carried Sarah through the familiar streets, her mind wandered to all the possibilities that still lay ahead. The city seemed to pulse with life, as if it too was waiting for her to discover the next adventure. She realized she had been too focused on the past for so long, but now she was learning to savor the present, to appreciate the little moments that made life meaningful. The bus ride was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of other passengers. Sarah gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur together as the night deepened. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace, like everything, even the chaos, was falling into place. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling lighter, as though the weight she had been carrying for so long had finally dissipated. She made herself a cup of coffee, savoring the aroma as it filled the kitchen. It was a simple pleasure, but today it felt like a triumph. Her phone buzzed again, a message from her colleague at work. Asterisk, big meeting today. Are you ready? Asterisk. Sarah smiled to herself. She had never been the one to enjoy meetings, but now she looked forward to the challenge. Her newfound confidence wasn't just in her personal life. It had begun to spill into every aspect of her existence. She took a deep breath and texted back, Asterisk, absolutely. Let's make it happen. Asterisk. At the meeting, her presence felt different. She spoke with clarity and purpose, offering solutions and insights that others hadn't thought of. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly valued in her work, not because of anyone's approval, but because she had come to value herself. As the meeting wrapped up, her boss offered a smile of appreciation. Great work, Sarah. Keep it up. And as she left the office that day, she realized something powerful. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She was enough, exactly as she was. That evening, as Sarah sat on her couch with a good book, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The past was gone. The future was still unfolding. But in this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. She could hear the city outside, the distant hum of life continuing on. But in her own space, there was only quiet, only peace. She had let go of the anger, the regret, and the fear. And in return, she had found the freedom to be herself, unapologetically. For the first time in years, Sarah felt truly at home, not just in the city, but in her own skin. And as the night stretched on, she knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. The journey was still far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. With each passing day, Sarah was learning how to live, truly live again. And that was all she ever needed to know. As the days went by, Sarah continued to embrace this new chapter with open arms. Each morning, she woke up with a quiet sense of excitement, as though the world itself was offering her a fresh start. She found herself reconnecting with old friends, rediscovering hobbies that once brought her joy, and even trying new experiences that she had never considered before. It was as if she had been reborn, shedding the layers of pain and self-doubt that had clouded her for so long. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Sarah saw a familiar face, Emma, sitting on a bench with a book in hand. She had been expecting a quiet afternoon, but the sight of her friend brought an unexpected rush of warmth to her heart. She walked over, a smile spreading across her face. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah asked, her voice light. "Not at all," Emma replied, gesturing to the space beside her. As Sarah sat down, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people in her life who had supported her, even when she wasn't sure she deserved it. There had been times when she thought she would never get to this place, this peaceful place. But now, sitting beside Emma, she realized that all of it, the pain and the healing, had been part of her journey. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their laughter filling the air around them. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt truly connected, not just to her past, but to her present. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the park, Emma looked at Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Emma said, "I've been thinking a lot about how much you've changed. Not in a bad way, of course. In a good way. You've become someone I really admire." Sarah blinked, surprised by the compliment. "I didn't know I could change this much," she said, her voice filled with a mix of wonder and humility. "But I guess you don't realize how strong you are until you have no choice but to be strong." Emma smiled, nodding. "You've always had that strength. You just had to find it again." As Sarah listened to her friend's words, she realized how true they were. She had always been strong, but the journey to rediscover that strength had taken time, patience, and a deep commitment to healing. Now, she was living proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, sometimes in ways she had never expected. As they stood up to leave, Sarah felt lighter than ever. The night was still young, and there was a part of her that couldn't wait to see what the future held. The only thing she was sure of was that she was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by who she had become, a woman who had learned to love herself again, who had learned to embrace the uncertainty, and who was ready for whatever came next. With a final hug to Emma, Sarah walked home, feeling the cool night air brush against her face. As she gazed up at the stars, she couldn't help but smile. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah was excited to take the next step, whatever it might be. And with each passing day, she knew she was writing her own story. A story of resilience, of redemption, and of an unbreakable spirit. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest gift of all. As Sarah continued to walk home, her steps felt lighter, each one filled with purpose. The night was peaceful, and the world around her seemed to breathe in time with her own rhythm. She had learned so much over the past few months, lessons about herself, about love, and about the strength it took to heal. But perhaps the greatest lesson was that she didn't have to have everything figured out all at once. The uncertainty of the future no longer felt like a looming threat. Instead, it felt like an invitation. She could be anyone, do anything. Her past, with all its trials and pain, had shaped her, but it didn't define her. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another message from her boss at work. Asterisk, "I've been thinking. How would you feel about taking on a bigger project? I think you're ready for more responsibility." Asterisk, Her heart skipped a beat. The idea of taking on a larger role excited her, but it also made her nervous. In the past, she would have hesitated, doubting her abilities. But tonight, Sarah felt different. She was no longer afraid of the challenges that lay ahead. With a smile, she typed back, "I'm ready. Let's do it." As she hit send, she felt a rush of confidence. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't second-guessing herself. She was stepping into her power, embracing all the opportunities that life had to offer. When Sarah arrived home, she made herself a cup of tea, sat down by the window, and watched the city continue its dance. The lights twinkled like stars in the distance, each one representing a life, a story unfolding. And in that moment, Sarah knew that her story was far from over. She was the author of her own life, and she was no longer waiting for permission to live it. As the night stretched on, Sarah took a deep breath, feeling more grounded than she ever had before. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready. With each new day, she was not just healing, but becoming stronger, more resilient, and more certain of her path. And as she closed her eyes to sleep, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She had found her peace, and no one could ever take that away from her. The journey was only just beginning. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm, golden glow across her room. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air that signaled the start of a new day. Every morning now felt like a small victory, a moment to appreciate all that she had worked for. She went about her routine with a sense of calm confidence. The small tasks, making breakfast, preparing for the day ahead, felt grounded, purposeful. As she sipped her coffee, she glanced out the window, watching people hurry by. It struck her how different her own journey had been compared to theirs, how far she had come, and how much more she had left to discover. Work is calling her, but today it felt different. She wasn't just going to do the work, she was going to excel at it. Her thoughts returned to the message she had received the night before about the bigger project. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also a chance to show herself, and everyone else, what she was capable of. At the office, Sarah entered the meeting room with her head held high. She took her seat, feeling a quiet confidence wash over her. The project would push her boundaries, but she was no longer the woman she had been, the woman who doubted herself. She was ready for this challenge. The meeting began, and Sarah found herself speaking up more than she ever had before. Her ideas flowed with ease, her voice steady and clear. She offered solutions, insights, and suggestions that not only impressed her colleagues but also herself. For the first time in a long time, she realized she wasn't just a participant in her work. She was a leader in her own right. The project was a success, not just because of the results, but because of the confidence Sarah had discovered within herself. When the meeting concluded, her boss offered a genuine smile. "Excellent work, Sarah," he said. "I'm glad we gave you this responsibility. You've exceeded our expectations." Her heart swelled with pride. But more than that, she felt something deeper, a sense of fulfillment that no external validation could provide. This was her victory, and it was hers alone. Later that evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment, she reflected on how much she had changed. There were still moments of uncertainty, of course, but now, she approached them with a sense of calm determination. The future didn't seem so daunting anymore. It seemed like an open road, full of possibilities. She reached for her phone and typed a quick message to Emma. "Thank you for always believing in me. I wouldn't be here without you." Emma's reply came almost immediately. "You've always had it in you, Sarah. I'm just glad you see it now." Sarah smiled, her heart full. She wasn't alone in this journey. She had friends, mentors, and a deep well of strength inside herself that she could tap into whenever she needed. The city outside was alive with activity, but inside her apartment, there was a quiet peace. Sarah was no longer searching for happiness or validation in places that didn't serve her. She had found it within herself, and that made all the difference. As the night drew to a close, Sarah turned off the lights, but not before taking one last look at the skyline. Tomorrow would be another day, full of challenges and triumphs, but Sarah was ready. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that happiness wasn't something to be found. It was something to be created within herself. And with that, she finally closed her eyes, content, knowing that whatever came next, she could handle it. Her journey was far from over, but it was hers to shape. The days following that evening felt like a seamless continuation of the growth Sarah had embraced. Each day brought its own little victories, but it was the quiet moments that stood out the most to her. In the mornings, she found herself taking longer walks, savoring the simple joy of her own company. The city felt more like a place she belonged, not just a backdrop to her life. She had become more attuned to the little details, the chirping of birds in the early morning, the warmth of sunlight on her skin, the sound of people's laughter echoing from nearby cafes. It all felt so alive, so vibrant. At work, her newfound confidence continued to shine. The larger project she had taken on was progressing smoothly, and she felt more capable with each passing day. Her colleagues began to look to her for guidance, asking for her input on decisions, and it was in those moments that Sarah realized just how far she had come. She was no longer merely a part of the team. She was a leader in her own right. One afternoon, while having lunch at her favorite spot in the park, Sarah received a call from her boss. "Sarah, we've been looking at the team's performance, and we think it's time to offer you a promotion," he said, his voice full of excitement. "We believe you're ready for the next step." Her heart skipped a beat, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a sense of pride swell inside her. She had earned this. It wasn't just about the title or the pay raise. It was about the journey she had been on to get to this point. She accepted the offer with a confident smile, and as she hung up the phone, a small laugh escaped her lips. "I did it," she whispered to herself. "I really did it." That evening, as she sat in her apartment, Sarah reflected on everything that had led her to this moment. She thought back to the woman she had been, the woman who had struggled to believe in herself, the woman who had been consumed by fear and doubt. And then she thought about the woman she had become, the woman who had learned to embrace change, to take risks, and to trust herself. The difference was night and day. As Sarah sat by her window, watching the sun set behind the skyline, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had built this new life from the ground up, and it was everything she had ever hoped for. She had faced the darkness of her past, the hurt and betrayal, and she had come out stronger on the other side. But now, she was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The future was still unknown, still full of uncertainties, but for the first time in her life, Sarah was no longer afraid of it. She was ready to embrace whatever came next, whether it was the challenges of her new role, the surprises life had in store, or the new connections she would continue to make. The world was hers to explore, and she was eager to see where the next chapter would take her. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the soft, comforting embrace of the evening air. Tomorrow would come, just like it always did, but now she welcomed it. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There were more adventures ahead, more growth to experience, and more joy to find in the quiet moments. But she was no longer searching. She had found her peace, her strength, and her place in the world. And that was all she ever needed to know. As the weeks passed, Sarah's life unfolded like a story she had always dreamed of writing, but never dared to imagine. The promotion she had received opened new doors, challenges that, in the past, might have overwhelmed her, but now felt like opportunities for growth. She embraced each task with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. And yet, as she continued to excel at work, it was the moments of personal reflection that became the most meaningful. One evening, Sarah found herself sitting on the balcony of her apartment, a soft breeze brushing against her face. She gazed out at the city, its lights twinkling like stars scattered across a dark canvas. It had been a year since she had found the strength to start over, and looking back now, she marveled at how far she had come. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but they no longer defined her. The woman she was now had learned to face those obstacles with a quiet resilience, no longer running from them, but walking through them with grace. She thought about the years she had spent trying to live up to expectations, both her own and others, and how, in the end, it was only when she stopped seeking approval that she truly found peace. It wasn't the success, the promotions, or the accolades that made her proud. It was the simple fact that she had learned to trust herself. That was the true victory. Sarah's phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Emma. Asterisk, celebration dinner tonight? You've earned it. Asterisk. Sarah smiled. She had earned it. As she prepared for the evening, Sarah reflected on the journey she had been on. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but it had been hers to make. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece from the inside out. And now, as she stepped into the world with a sense of purpose and self-assurance, she knew that this was only the beginning. The story wasn't over. It had simply shifted into a new chapter, one full of limitless possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah couldn't wait to see where the next page would take her.